O Lord, make us the incarnation of your peace. Take our minds and think through them. Take our mouths and speak through them. Take our hands and work through them, and take our hearts and set them on fire for Christ's sake. Amen. Please. Our collect today asks, "Grant that we may share the divine life of him who humbled himself to share our humanity, your Son, Jesus Christ." Humility, not one of our core American values these days. It's been lacking in our political and social zeitgeist for some time. Expressions of humility are often derided as weakness. President Carter was probably one of our greatest examples of humble leadership, and he was mocked and vilified for his presidency. And yet, if you insist that we embrace fundamental biblical teachings, there is no avoiding the fact that our Judeo-Christian tradition condemns arrogance and lifts up humility as high as any cross. After all, what greater expression of humility could there be than laying down one's own life in seeming defeat and failure for the sake of humanity? Now, if we were to ask ourselves, which of my failures have taught me the most, and what did I learn from them, that, friends, could be instructive, because any truly honest person would have to admit on multiple failures in any given week, much less a lifetime. And if we cannot think of anything that we have learned, it says far more about the kind of Christians we are than any of our accomplishments. Can you imagine how refreshing it would be if candidates for public office answered such a question thoughtfully and honestly? If I were to distill the essence of most of my personal failures, I think it would be along the lines of those instances where I've done or said things based on how they made me look, rather than on how they serve God's creation. Because I inevitably walk away from those experiences miserable and unfulfilled, rather than at peace and satisfied. Humility is at the core of our incarnation narratives. We first saw that in the nativity reading from Luke, with which we began our 12-day Christmas journey, complete with a lowly manger and shepherd witnesses. But we also see it in the distinct and very different Matthean nativity story, which we read this morning. With Christ now incarnate, we are challenged to explore how our Christ is most effectively manifested in the world, and what are the world's reactions. And the profound truth is that Christ was made flesh, not just because he was born of a human child, but rather because he is potentially born again and again, made flesh over and over in each and every one of us who claim to be his followers. But we must be humble enough to allow ourselves to be followers, even when we are put in leadership positions. The early Christian communities were called people of the way. So, what is this way that we follow? How do we manifest Christ's way to the world? And it begins with our humility. To manifest Christ's way in our lives and the world's, we must humble ourselves. We can't pretend that we know the answers or that we even know where we're going. We must simply let go, perhaps even look foolish, and then let ourselves be surprised, even awed by what might be revealed. Because God is in control, not us, no matter how much we seek to take that control. That's driven home over and over in Matthew's narrative. But we need to be careful not to confuse humility and insecurity. Humility is not the absence of self-regard. It's not believing that you are weak or ineffective or unimportant. What I call lowly worm theology. Those qualities are fodder for overcompensation or complete self-destruction. Sometimes the weak and insecure look to tyrannical expressions of power and ally themselves with it to feel worthy and control in our lives. And we've seen several expressions of that throughout our history. But truly humble people are not insecure. They often have incredible self-regard and additionally, and more importantly, incredible regard for others. They realize that their own worth is wrapped up in the worth and indeed the preciousness of every living creature because they recognize and are curious about the divine everywhere. The Magi in our story were certainly secure individuals. I mean, after all, they risked a potentially dangerous journey. And they were confident, but they were far from arrogant. They trusted their learning and took a grand adventure to a foreign land, but they were on a quest, infused with a humility and curiosity. They were there to learn, to be taken by surprise. So much so that they were willing to bow down to a child and give him everything they valued. And they didn't care if it made them look foolish or even crazy, which if you think about it, they really did look a little crazy. They arrived in Palestine from Persia or Babylon or who knows, maybe South Asia, and while they believed that they had information that indicated a divine occurrence, they asked questions, they asked directions, they asked for history and help. They didn't give a lecture about astrology or tell people that they encountered what they were to think or do. So compare that with Herod. Everyone in Matthew's day knew of Herod the Great. He was infamous. His Jewish credentials, sketchy at best. And given his tenuous legitimacy, Herod sought to cement his authority and identity another way: utter brutality and opportunism. He was not even above murdering his own family members. And there was the wholesale slaughtering of children under 2 to ensure his continuity of power and the approval of the Romans who put him in power in the first place. You might imagine him akin to a Saddam Hussein or either of the Assads. He was a prolific builder of monuments to himself, and in fact started the rebuilding of the great Jerusalem temple to win over his skeptical Jewish critics. You see, despite Herod's extensive power, he was anything but secure. We're told at the beginning he was afraid, which probably accounted for his excessive reliance on brutality and force. And given that insecurity and humility are nowhere near equivalents, Herod's attempts at false humility fell very short. Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may go and pay him homage. Right. He feigned awe and curiosity, but we're told from the outset that fear was what held him captive, and his core was ultimately transparent. So the wise men returned home by another road. I don't think they needed a whole lot of angelic intervention to get the point across. Now, another example of humility can be found in the approach of our gospel writer, Matthew. Like Luke, Matthew composed his gospel in the latter part of the first century, after the brutal put-down of the Jewish uprisings by their Roman overlords and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Each gospel writer was telling his story to a distinct community. Luke's community was primarily Gentile, but Matthew's audience was devoutly Jewish. Seeking to understand what this latest tragedy meant, considering their dashed messianic expectations. Throughout Matthew's gospel, we repeatedly hear the phrase, "This was to fulfill what had been spoken to, or written by, or designed, or through the prophets, or the scriptures, etc." Every element of Jesus' story was designed to respect and affirm Jewish scriptural expectations of the Messiah. Now, for Matthew to be effective in his argument, this was imperative. He knew that he had to serve his community through the story that he told. If he was going to expose the radical truth of God's inclusive and redeeming love for the entire world through Christ and his chosen people, it was essential to establish Jesus' Jewish bona fides so that his audience could hear that truth. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus' Jewish genealogical history was affirmed, rooted in Abraham, and with the patrimony linking Jesus to the first beloved king, David. And Jesus' parents, Joseph and Mary, were established in the Bethlehem community, no traveling from suspect and culturally diverse Galilee. And to top it off, Matthew set up Jesus as the new Moses, going to Egypt, Moses' birthplace, surviving the wholesale slaughter of Jewish children, as did the infant Moses, and returning from exile to the Holy Land of Israel. By knowing his audience and serving his audience, Matthew was able to tell his story in such a way that despite the subversive elements of the story, such as the foreigners, those magi getting it first, his audience could hear what he was saying. Matthew said, "I know you. I'm one of you. So trust me, this is good news for us." And Matthew was trying to get his community to understand the role they play as children of God on behalf of even their most foreign neighbors. So he picked a brilliant narrative device. If we are to be effective bearers of this universally good news in the world, if we are to incarnate Christ effectively, we too must keep in mind that we are always foreign guests in the hearts of everyone we meet. It's always a question of humility. We cannot expect that we accurately know a single truth about the temporal and emotional history of those we encounter. We must be seekers. Like Matthew, we must foster listening hearts in everyone we encounter by speaking their language, honoring their traditions, asking for their directions and insights, not by imposing a foreign and dominating narrative. Like the Magi, we must not assume that we know the way. We must be generous in our responses to others and ever vigilant listeners. So, for this new year, instead of making resolutions that we hope will make us look better, let us resolve this year to ask directions more often than we give them, to listen more than we speak, to take the time learning the language of others' hearts so that we might better communicate God's divine love for all. Let us be the antidote to the language of arrogance and resolve to lift up the language of love and wonder. And with that, I wish you all a final Merry Christmas and a happy, almost Epiphany. Thanks be to God.